The first insult came before Emily Carter even sat down, and it came from an empty chair. It was placed at the head of the Whitmore dining table, beneath a crystal chandelier that made every silver fork shine like it belonged in a museum. The chair was taller than the others, darker than the others, and completely untouched, as if the entire evening had been built around whoever was supposed to sit there. Emily noticed it the second she walked into the room with Daniel's hand resting lightly on her back. For one quiet moment, she thought maybe it was for her father, because Daniel had mentioned a special guest, someone connected to his family's business. But then Margaret Whitmore looked Emily up and down, from her simple navy dress to the small wrapped gift in her hands, and smiled with the kind of politeness that made a person feel smaller. "Oh, no, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice soft enough to sound graceful and sharp enough to cut. "That seat is reserved for someone important." A few people at the table lowered their eyes. Daniel's sister Vanessa covered a smile with her wineglass. Richard Whitmore, Daniel's father, did not smile at all. He only checked his watch, as if Emily's arrival was an interruption between more valuable things. Daniel gave Emily's shoulder a gentle squeeze, but he said nothing. That silence landed harder than Margaret's words. Emily stood there holding the gift she had spent 2 hours choosing, a hand-painted serving bowl from a small shop in Boston, something warm, personal, thoughtful. Suddenly, it looked painfully ordinary in a dining room, where even the candles seemed expensive. "Mom," Daniel said quietly, almost pleading, but not strongly enough to change anything. Margaret turned toward the table. "Please, Emily, sit wherever you're comfortable." But every chair had already been chosen. Every place card had a name. Every smile in the room told her the truth before anyone said it out loud. This was not a welcome dinner. This was a test. Emily sat beside Daniel, placed the unopened gift near her plate, and folded her hands in her lap. She did not defend herself. She did not explain who she was. She only glanced once at the empty chair, then lowered her eyes to her phone under the edge of the table and typed 4 words to the one man she had. Hoped she would not need tonight. "Dad, I need you." Emily kept her phone beneath the edge of the table for only 1 second longer, just long enough to see the message deliver. Then she turned the screen face down on her lap and looked up with a calm expression that cost her more than anyone in that room could have guessed. Around her, the Whitmore dining room glowed with polished confidence. The walls were lined with framed photographs of charity galas, yacht clubs, university ceremonies, and black-tie events where everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Every portrait told the same story. Old money, perfect posture, controlled smiles, and a family that had spent generations learning how to make outsiders feel like guests who had overstayed. Emily had grown up around good manners, but the Whitmores had turned manners into a weapon. Margaret lifted her napkin from her lap and gave Emily a warm smile that did not reach her eyes. "Daniel tells us you work in community education," she said, placing just enough sweetness on the words to make them sound harmless. "That must be very meaningful." Emily nodded. "It is. I help coordinate reading programs and after-school support for children who need extra help." "How noble," Vanessa said from across the table. She leaned back, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "I always admire people who can be fulfilled by simple things." A quiet chuckle passed near the end of the table. Daniel shifted beside Emily, but still said nothing. Emily felt the old instinct to soften the room, to make everyone comfortable even while they were making her uncomfortable. She almost smiled. She almost thanked Vanessa for the insult disguised as praise. But instead, she simply said, "It matters to the families." That answer made Vanessa blink, because it did not give her anything to laugh at. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. "And your family, Emily?" Daniel has been surprisingly vague. "Carter is a common name. Are your parents from Boston as well?" Emily's hand rested near her fork. "My father lives mostly between Boston and New York. My mother passed away when I was in college." For the first time that evening, the room softened by half an inch, but only for a breath. Margaret tilted her head. "I am sorry to hear that. Losing a mother so young must have been difficult." "It was," Emily said. "She was a kind person." "Kindness is lovely," Margaret said, then looked toward Daniel with a sigh that sounded almost rehearsed. "Though in families like ours, kindness alone is not always enough." Daniel finally spoke, but his voice was low, careful, built to avoid conflict rather than stop it. Mom, Emily is not here for an interview. Margaret touched his wrist. Of course not, darling. We are only getting to know the woman you brought to our table. Surely that is fair. Daniel looked at Emily as if asking her to understand. That look hurt more than the question. He was not asking his mother to stop. He was asking Emily to endure it gracefully. A server entered with the first course, and for a few minutes the room filled with the soft sounds of china, silverware, and polite conversation that moved around Emily without ever truly including her. Guests asked Richard about the Whitmore Group expansion. Someone mentioned a waterfront development in Miami. Another person spoke about regulatory issues and private investors. Emily listened quietly, not because she did not understand, but because she understood enough to know these people assumed she could not. Then Margaret turned back to her with a smile. Emily, I hope this menu is not too unusual for you. Daniel mentioned you prefer simple places. Vanessa laughed softly. Remember when Daniel took her to that little diner outside Worcester? He said she loved it. The way she said diner made it sound like a character flaw. Emily looked at Daniel, waiting for him to correct the tone, to say he loved that diner too, that he had been the one who chose it after a long drive, that they had shared fries at midnight and laughed until they forgot the rain outside. But Daniel only reached for his wine glass and stared into it. Emily answered for both of them. The food was good. The waitress had worked there for 27 years. She knew every regular by name. I like that. Vanessa smiled. How charming. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, as if Emily's calmness was beginning to irritate her. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected nervous laughter. She had expected Emily to shrink. Instead, Emily remained polite, still, and unreadable. That made the game less entertaining. Richard leaned back in his chair. Daniel has always had a generous heart, sometimes too generous. He sees potential in people and forgets that marriage is not a charity project. The sentence settled over the table like smoke. Emily heard it clearly. So did Daniel. This time, there was no mistaking it, no pretending it was just concern or tradition or family standards. Richard Whitmore had called her a project. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at his father, then at his mother, then at Emily. She could see the battle in him, small and panicked, the battle between love and training, between what he knew was right and what he had been taught never to challenge in public. He opened his mouth. Margaret placed one hand gently on his sleeve. He closed it. Emily looked away first, not because she was weak, but because she did not want him to see the exact moment her hope in him changed shape. At the far end of the table, one of Richard's business associates asked about the empty chair. Is he still coming tonight? Richard checked his phone. He should be. His assistant confirmed the car left the airport about 40 minutes ago. Margaret straightened, and suddenly her voice warmed in a way Emily had not heard all evening. We are very honored. This could be a turning point for the family. For the company, Richard corrected, though pride lifted his tone. For both, Margaret said. Then she looked at Emily again, and the contrast was impossible to miss. To the unseen guest, she offered reverence. To Emily, she offered tolerance. You must understand, Emily, evenings like this are delicate. Certain relationships take years to build. One careless impression can affect more than people realize. Emily met her eyes. I understand impressions. Do you? Vanessa asked. She picked up her glass and studied Emily over the rim. Because first impressions are important. And tonight is, well, it is a lot for someone who is not used to this world. The room grew quieter, not because anyone disagreed, but because everyone wanted to see how Emily would respond. She could feel Daniel beside her, tense and silent. She could feel Margaret waiting for a crack. She could feel Richard measuring her, as if she were a risk on a balance sheet. Emily thought of her father then, not as the man the Whitmores were waiting for, not as the name that could change the temperature in the room, but as the father who had taught her never to confuse volume with strength. Robert Carter rarely raised his voice. He had always told her that people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed there would be no consequences. So Emily gave the Whitmores the space to reveal themselves. She placed her napkin neatly beside her plate and said, You are right. First impressions are important. Margaret smiled, thinking she had won. I am glad you see that. I do, Emily said. I have learned a lot tonight. For a moment, something passed across Daniel's face, a flicker of worry, as though he finally understood that Emily was not just hurt. She was listening. She was remembering, and she was quietly deciding what kind of future he was asking her to enter. Margaret did not notice. Vanessa did not notice. Richard was too busy watching the driveway through the tall windows. Headlights swept briefly across the glass, and the room changed instantly. Richard stood halfway from his chair. Margaret smoothed her dress. Vanessa adjusted her bracelet. Even the guests lifted their posture as if royalty had arrived. Emily did not move. Her heart beat once, slow and heavy, because she already knew who was outside. But no one else did. Richard smiled for the first time all evening, a real smile filled with ambition and relief. At last, he said, "The guest who can change everything." Daniel turned toward the window, then back to Emily, confused by the sudden calm in her eyes. She looked down at the empty chair at the head of the table, the one Margaret had said was reserved for someone important, and for the first time that night, Emily almost smiled. The headlights moved across the tall windows like a signal, and every person at the table reacted as if the real evening had finally begun. Richard Whitmore pushed back his chair and fastened the button of his jacket. Margaret touched her earrings, then smoothed the front of her cream-colored dress with both hands. Vanessa sat up straighter, her smile suddenly polished and eager. Even the guests who had spent the past hour pretending Emily was invisible turned toward the entrance hall with interest. Emily stayed seated. Daniel noticed. He leaned closer and whispered, "Are you okay?" It was the first time all night he had asked her that, and the timing made the question feel smaller than it should have. Emily looked at him, not angry, not dramatic, just quiet. "I am listening," she said. Daniel frowned as if he did not understand. Before he could ask what she meant, the front door opened, and footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. But it was not Robert Carter who entered the dining room. It was a young woman in a silver dress, carrying herself with the ease of someone who had been welcomed in rich rooms her entire life. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her smile was bright, and her confidence filled the space before she spoke a word. Vanessa stood first. "Claire, you made it." Claire Bennett stepped into the room as if she belonged to the chandelier, the polished floors, and every crystal glass on the table. Margaret's face lit up in a way it never had for Emily. "Claire, darling, we were beginning to worry." Claire kissed Margaret on the cheek, then Richard, then turned toward Daniel with warm familiarity. "Danny, it has been too long." "Danny." Emily heard the name and felt the table shift around her. Daniel stood awkwardly and accepted a brief hug, careful, tense, clearly uncomfortable, but not enough to step away quickly. Claire turned her blue eyes toward Emily, and for half a second, her smile paused. Not because she was cruel right away, but because she had been taught to understand a room quickly. She saw the seating arrangement. She saw the unopened gift by Emily's plate. She saw the empty chair at the head of the table. She saw Daniel standing between two worlds and choosing neither with courage. Margaret reached for Claire's hand. "Emily, this is Claire Bennett. Her father and Richard have known each other for years. The Bennetts are practically family." Vanessa added, "Claire and Daniel grew up together. Summer houses, fundraisers, all those boring family things that turn out to matter later." The sentence was wrapped in nostalgia, but aimed at Emily like a reminder that history was another form of wealth. Emily stood, because her mother had raised her to be gracious even when other people forgot how. "It is nice to meet you, Claire." Claire smiled. "You too, Emily. Daniel mentioned you." That was polite enough. But Margaret quickly took control of the moment. "Claire, you must sit with us. We saved you a place." Emily looked at the table. There was no empty place near Margaret. There was no new chair being brought in. Then Vanessa moved her purse from the chair directly across from Daniel, a place that had been open the whole time. Emily understood then that Claire had not just arrived. She had been planned. The empty chair at the head of the table was for the important business guest, but Claire's chair had been waiting too, hidden in plain sight, held like a quiet insult. Daniel understood at the same moment. His face tightened. "Mom," he said, low enough that only Emily and Margaret could hear. Margaret did not look at him. "Claire came all this way, Daniel. Do not be rude." Claire sat down across from him, and immediately the room became easier for everyone except Emily. Margaret asked Claire about her nonprofit board. Richard asked about her father's real estate portfolio. Vanessa praised her dress. A guest mentioned seeing Claire in a magazine feature about young philanthropists in New England. Every compliment floated over the table, but each one landed near Emily. Claire had the right schools, the right last name, the right family friends, the right stories, the right kind of polish. Emily had a hand-painted serving bowl that no one had opened. Daniel tried to bring Emily back into the conversation once. Emily actually runs one of the most successful literacy programs in her district. Margaret smiled without looking at her. That is sweet. Claire, to her credit, turned toward Emily with real interest. That sounds meaningful. What ages do you work with? Emily answered, mostly elementary and middle school students. Some are reading 2 or 3 grade levels behind, so we build support around confidence first. Claire nodded. That must take patience. It does, Emily said. And consistency. Richard gave a short laugh, not loud enough to seem openly rude, but loud enough to be heard. Consistency is important in business too, though the stakes can be somewhat different. Vanessa tilted her head. Do your programs raise much money, Emily? Or is it mostly volunteer work? Daniel's hand moved under the table, and for a second Emily thought he might take hers. Instead, he gripped his own knee. Emily said, we raise enough to keep the programs running. But the work is not measured only in money. Margaret sighed softly, as if Emily had proven a point she had been waiting for. That is a lovely belief. Very idealistic. Claire looked uncomfortable now. She glanced at Daniel, perhaps expecting him to redirect the conversation. He did not. The comparison had become too obvious to ignore, and everyone knew it. Margaret began telling a story about Daniel and Claire as teenagers at a Cape Cod charity auction. How Daniel had accidentally bid on a painting because Claire dared him to raise his paddle, how their parents laughed about it for years. Vanessa added details. Richard smiled. The guests joined in. Emily sat beside Daniel and listened to memories that had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with the future Margaret wanted. Then Margaret raised her glass. There is something to be said for people who understand the world they are marrying into. The table quieted. Daniel looked sharply at his mother. That is enough. The words came out, but they came softly, almost privately, without the force of a man willing to risk anything. Margaret looked pleased that he had spoken too late and too gently. I am simply saying compatibility matters. Shared values matter. Family background matters. Vanessa's smile returned. No one wants Daniel to wake up 10 years from now and realize love was not enough. That sentence hit the room differently. It was not just an insult. It was a warning dressed as wisdom. Emily looked down at her plate, not because she was ashamed, but because she was carefully placing every moment where it belonged. Margaret had insulted her dress. Vanessa had mocked her work. Richard had questioned her family. Now they had brought in another woman to show her the life they believed Daniel should have chosen. Daniel finally turned toward Emily. They do not mean it like that, he whispered. Emily looked at him slowly. Then how do they mean it? He had no answer. Across the table, Claire set down her fork and said quietly, maybe we should talk about something else. For the first time, Emily saw that Claire was not the villain of the evening. She was a symbol, invited into a performance she had not fully understood until she was seated inside it. But Margaret was not finished. She lifted her glass again, and this time her smile was perfect, smooth, and cold. I only believe that some women grow into a family naturally, she said, and others simply do not belong, no matter how badly they want to. No one laughed loudly. They did not need to. The silence after the sentence was worse. Daniel froze. Richard looked into his glass. Vanessa watched Emily with open satisfaction. Claire stared at Margaret, stunned. Emily placed both hands calmly on the table and looked at the empty chair at the head of it. The chair still waited. The house still held its breath for the powerful guest who was supposedly minutes away. Margaret thought that guest would save their business future. Richard thought that guest would confirm their place among people who mattered. Daniel thought the worst part of the night had already happened. But Emily knew the truth, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself one small, unreadable smile. Because the man they were waiting for had already received her message. And when he walked in, the Whitmores would finally learn that the woman they had spent the evening measuring was the one person in the room they should never have underestimated. Emily held Margaret's stare for one long second, and the room seemed to pause around that small, unreadable smile. It was not joy. It was not revenge. It was the quiet realization that people could spend an entire evening revealing their character without ever knowing they were being judged. Daniel noticed the smile first, and it unsettled him more than tears would have. If Emily had cried, he could have comforted her. If she had raised her voice, he could have asked her to calm down. But this calmness gave him nothing to manage, nothing to soften, nothing to hide behind. "Emily," he said under his breath, "please do not take this the wrong way." She turned to him slowly. What would be the right way to take it? His face flushed. Across the table, Vanessa leaned back as if she had been waiting all night for Emily to finally lose her composure. Margaret placed her glass down with careful grace. Richard looked toward the windows again, impatient for the guest who had not yet entered, but still interested enough to listen. Claire sat frozen, her earlier confidence replaced by discomfort. She had grown up around social games, but even she seemed surprised by how cruel this one had become. Daniel swallowed. "My family can be intense," he said. "They are protective." Emily looked at the faces around the table. Protective of what? No one answered. The question was too simple, and that made it dangerous. Margaret smiled thinly. Protective of Daniel, of course. He has a generous heart, and sometimes generous people need guidance. Emily nodded once, as if she were finally hearing the truth spoken plainly. "Guidance away from me." Daniel turned sharply toward his mother. That is not what she meant. But his voice still carried the weakness of someone asking for peace, not truth. Margaret sighed, and looked at Emily with practiced sympathy. "You seem like a pleasant young woman. But pleasant is not the same as prepared. Marriage into a family like ours comes with expectations, responsibilities, pressures. It is not just dinner at small-town restaurants and weekend drives. It is reputation. It is legacy. It is knowing how to stand beside a man whose choices affect hundreds of employees." Emily let the sentence settle. She thought about the children in her reading program, the parents working double shifts, the school meetings that ran late because someone's bus route had changed, the grants she had written at midnight because a classroom needed books. She knew responsibility. She knew pressure. She simply did not package it in diamonds and waterfront property. "You are right," Emily said softly. "Standing beside someone matters." Daniel looked relieved for half a breath, as if he thought she was yielding. Then she looked directly at him. "But so does knowing whether that person will stand beside you." The relief vanished from his face. Margaret's expression tightened. Vanessa lifted her eyebrows. Richard checked his watch again and muttered, "This is becoming unnecessary." Emily heard him, but she did not look away from Daniel. "I have been insulted since the moment I walked through your door," she said, her voice still calm enough that no one could accuse her of making a scene. "Your mother told me where I did not belong. Your sister treated my work like a hobby. Your father measured my family like a bad investment. Then they invited another woman to sit across from you and reminded me, in front of everyone, that she fits better into the life they want for you." Daniel opened his mouth, but Emily raised one hand slightly, not to silence him harshly, only to ask for the space he had not given her all evening. "And every time I waited for you to say one clear thing. Not something quiet, not something careful, not something that could be mistaken for politeness. One clear thing." Daniel's eyes lowered. That small movement told Emily everything. He was ashamed, but shame was not courage. He cared, but care without action had left her alone at a table full of people who were comfortable humiliating her. Margaret leaned forward, her voice sharper now. "Daniel does not owe you a performance. This is exactly what concerns me. You are turning a family dinner into some kind of emotional trial." Emily looked at her. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. You did that before I arrived." The silence after that was complete. Even Richard stopped looking at his watch. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Claire looked down at her plate, but Emily could tell she was listening closely. Daniel whispered, "Emily, please." There it was again. "Not please, Mom, stop. Not please, everyone, apologize. Not please, treat the woman I love with respect. Just Emily, please." The request was small, desperate, and pointed in the wrong direction. It asked her to make the room comfortable again. It asked her to protect him from the consequences of his silence. Something inside her settled into place. Not anger. Not bitterness. Clarity. Margaret saw it and mistook it for weakness. "Perhaps," she said, "this is the perfect time for honesty. Daniel has a future that has been carefully built. He needs a wife who understands that future, not someone who has to be taught how to enter a room like this." Daniel finally snapped his head toward her. "Mother, stop." The words were louder than before, but they arrived too late and still not strong enough. Margaret gave him a wounded look. "I am trying to save you from a mistake." Emily felt the engagement ring on her finger then, cool and delicate, a promise Daniel had made on a quiet walking path beside the Charles River 3 months earlier. He had held both of her hands that day and told her he wanted a life built on honesty, not performance. She had believed him. Maybe he had believed himself too. But love spoken in private had to survive public pressure, and tonight it had not. Slowly, Emily removed the ring. Daniel watched her do it, and his face changed before anyone else understood what was happening. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking into panic. She placed the ring beside her untouched water glass. It made the softest sound against the table, but somehow everyone heard it. Vanessa sat forward. Margaret went still. Richard's eyes narrowed, not with concern for Emily, but with irritation at the timing. "This is dramatic," Margaret said, but her voice had lost some of its control. Emily looked at Daniel one last time as his fiancé. "No," she said. "This is honest." Daniel reached toward the ring, but stopped before touching it. "Do not do this here." Emily's expression did not change. "You let them do everything else here." That sentence struck him with more force than if she had shouted. He had no defense against it because it was true. Claire quietly pushed her chair back from the table, as if she no longer wanted to be part of the display. "I think I should leave," she said. Margaret turned on her immediately. "Claire, sit down." Claire paused, surprised by the command in Margaret's tone. Richard stood fully now, his attention pulled toward the foyer. Voices murmured outside the dining room, low and formal. A car door closed somewhere beyond the windows. Another set of footsteps crossed the marble entrance, slower than Claire's had been, heavier with purpose. Richard's entire posture changed. The irritation vanished from his face and was replaced by anticipation. "Finally," he said, smoothing his jacket again. Margaret inhaled and forced her expression back into elegance. Vanessa adjusted her posture. The guest straightened as though nothing uncomfortable had happened at all. Daniel did not move. His eyes stayed fixed on the ring lying between him and Emily, a small circle of gold that suddenly looked like evidence. Emily picked up her phone from her lap and saw one message on the screen. It was from her father. 2 words. "I am here." Her heartbeat remained steady. She placed the phone face down beside the ring. Richard stepped toward the doorway with a smile prepared for power, money, and salvation. "Everyone," he announced, as the footsteps reached the dining room. "Please welcome the man we have all been waiting for." Daniel finally looked up, and for the first time all night, he saw that Emily was not afraid. Then the doorway darkened, the room went silent, and Emily stood before anyone spoke her father's name. Robert Carter entered the dining room without raising his voice, without rushing, and without looking at the people who had been waiting for him as if their entire future depended on his approval. He wore a dark tailored suit, a white shirt, and a gray tie, simple enough that nothing about him asked for attention, yet the room gave it to him instantly. The conversation died before he crossed the threshold. Richard Whitmore stepped forward with both hands ready, his smile wide, polished, and hungry with relief. "Mr. Carter," he said, almost breathless. "What an honor. We were beginning to worry traffic had delayed you." Robert did not take his hand right away. His eyes moved past Richard, past Margaret, past Vanessa, past Claire Bennett standing half out of her chair, and landed on Emily. Only then did his expression change. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the smallest softening around his eyes, the kind only a daughter would recognize. "Emily," he said. One word. That was all it took. Richard's hand remained in the air for half a second too long. Margaret's smile froze. Vanessa blinked as if she had misheard. Daniel turned slowly from Emily to the man in the doorway, his face losing color as understanding began to form, but did not yet have the courage to become real. Emily stood straighter. "Hi, Dad." The word fell into the room like a glass dropped on marble. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed comfortably. Richard lowered his hand as if he had forgotten why it was there. Margaret looked from Robert to Emily, then back again, trying to rebuild the evening in her mind and failing because every piece now pointed in the wrong direction. The woman she had dismissed as unprepared was Robert Carter's daughter. The woman Vanessa had mocked as simple was the daughter of the man the Whitmore group had been pursuing for months. The woman Richard had measured like a liability was connected to the investor whose decision could determine whether their Miami expansion survived. Robert walked toward Emily first, not toward the empty chair, not toward Richard, not toward the business associates waiting with nervous smiles. He stopped beside his daughter and looked at the ring lying near her water glass. Then he looked at Daniel. No accusation, no speech, just a quiet, steady look that made Daniel drop his eyes. "Are you all right?" Robert asked Emily. His voice was low, controlled, and deeply familiar. Emily nodded once. "I am now." That answer did something to the room. It told everyone that there had been a before and an after, and that Robert had entered too late to prevent what happened but soon enough to understand it. Richard recovered first because men like him were trained to protect opportunity even when dignity had already collapsed. "Mr. Carter, I had no idea," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded thin in the silence. "None of us had any idea Emily was your daughter." Daniel certainly never mentioned the connection. Daniel looked at Emily, ashamed. He had known her father's name, of course. He had met Robert once briefly at a quiet brunch in Cambridge months earlier, but Emily had never introduced him as an investor, never explained the scale of his influence, never used her family name as a key to open doors. Daniel had assumed Robert was successful, private, maybe involved in finance, but he had not cared enough to ask beyond what Emily wanted to share. And now that ignorance stood exposed beside his silence, Robert turned to Richard. "That appears to be true." Richard tried to smile again. "Well, this is a surprising and wonderful coincidence. Please sit. We have been looking forward to this conversation." He gestured toward the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair Margaret had so carefully separated from Emily's worth. Robert looked at it, then at Emily's place beside Daniel, then at the unopened gift near her plate. His eyes paused on the small wrapped package. "Is that yours?" he asked her. Emily glanced at the gift. "Yes, I brought it for Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret's face shifted instantly into warmth, but it was too late to make warmth believable. "Oh, Emily, you should have said something. How thoughtful of you." Emily did not answer. Robert looked at Margaret for the first time. She should not have needed to announce thoughtfulness for it to be recognized. Margaret's lips parted, then closed. Vanessa looked down at her bracelet. Claire, still standing, quietly stepped back from the table as if making space for truth to move through the room. Richard cleared his throat. "I am sure there has been some misunderstanding. Family dinners can be emotional, and perhaps some comments were taken in a way they were not intended." Robert's expression remained calm. "I arrived before I entered the room." The sentence confused them for 1 second. Then the meaning landed. He had been in the foyer. He had heard enough. Margaret's hand tightened around the back of her chair. Richard's polished confidence cracked at the edges. Daniel looked as if he wanted to disappear. Robert continued, still without raising his voice. "I heard my daughter being told she did not belong. I heard her work reduced to something small. I heard her family questioned, as if her value depended on whether you recognized the name attached to her. I heard another young woman used as a comparison she did not ask to be part of. And I heard the man who asked my daughter to marry him ask her to explain herself instead of asking this table to show basic respect." Daniel flinched because every word was true and none of it was exaggerated. Emily looked at her father, surprised by how much he had heard, but not surprised by how carefully he had understood. Margaret tried to rescue herself with softness. "Mr. Carter, you must understand, we were only concerned for Daniel. Emily is lovely, truly, but our world can be difficult to enter." Robert looked around the room, slowly, taking in the chandelier, the silver, the flowers, the guests, the stiff postures, the fear now hiding behind expensive manners. "Your world," he said, "does not appear difficult to enter. It appears difficult to admire." The words were quiet, but they changed the temperature of the entire room. Richard stepped in quickly. "Robert, may I call you Robert? This evening was meant to bring people together. The last thing we want is tension. Daniel loves Emily. That is clear. And if we had known who she was," he stopped too late. Robert's eyes sharpened just slightly. "If you had known who she was, what would have changed?" Richard opened his mouth, but no intelligent answer came out. Because the honest answer was everything. Margaret would have opened the gift. Vanessa would have praised Emily's dress. Richard would have asked about her father with admiration instead of suspicion. Daniel might have found courage sooner because the cost of silence would have been obvious. Robert let the silence expose them. Then he looked toward Claire. "Miss Bennet, I apologize that you were placed in this position." Claire's face flushed with embarrassment, but her voice was steady. "Thank you. I did not realize what I was walking into." "I believe you," Robert said. That simple kindness made Claire look even more uncomfortable, not because it hurt, but because it was the first truly decent thing anyone in power had offered her all evening. Richard tried again, desperation now breaking through the polish. "Mr. Carter, the proposal documents are ready in my study. We can take a few minutes, reset the evening, and discuss the Miami expansion privately. I think you will find the numbers very attractive." Robert turned to him fully. "I reviewed the numbers before I came." Richard's expression brightened slightly, mistaking this for hope. "Excellent. Then you know the upside." "I know the upside," Robert said. "I also came here tonight to understand the people behind it." Richard stopped smiling. Margaret looked quickly at Daniel, as if he might somehow fix what she had spent the night breaking. But Daniel was still staring at the ring on the table. He looked younger than he had an hour ago, not like a man ready for marriage, but like a son who had never learned how to stand apart from his family. Robert stepped toward the empty chair, and every eye followed him. For one brief second, it looked as if he might sit down and allow the evening to continue under new rules. Instead, he rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair and looked at Margaret. "You said this seat was reserved for someone important." Margaret swallowed. "I did not mean—" "Yes," Robert said. "You did." He turned the chair slightly away from the table, a small gesture with a finality that made Richard's face tighten. "My daughter was invited here as family and treated like a stranger. I was invited here as money and treated like salvation. That tells me everything I needed to know." Daniel finally stood. "Mr. Carter, please. I love Emily." Robert looked at him, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Then you should have loved her out loud before you knew anyone powerful was listening." Daniel had no answer. Emily felt the words move through her slowly, not as punishment, but as confirmation of what she had already understood when she removed the ring. Love that arrived after proof of status was not protection. It was regret dressed up as devotion. Richard's phone buzzed on the table, then again, but he did not touch it. His business associates exchanged nervous glances. Everyone understood that the meeting had changed, and not in a way numbers could repair. Robert turned back to Emily. "Do you want to stay?" The question was simple. It gave her back the only thing the room had tried to take from her all evening: choice. Daniel looked at her with pleading eyes. Margaret looked terrified for the first time, not of Emily, but of what Emily's answer might cost. Vanessa stared at the table. Claire held her breath. Emily looked around the dining room one last time, at the candles, the untouched food, the empty chair, the unopened gift, the ring lying beside her glass, and finally at Daniel. She remembered every gentle promise he had made in private. Then she remembered every silence he had chosen in public. Her voice did not shake when she answered her father. "No," Robert nodded, as if he had expected nothing else, but had needed her to say it for herself. He picked up the small wrapped gift from beside her plate and handed it back to her with care. Then he looked at Richard Whitmore and said, "There will be no business discussion tonight." Richard stepped forward quickly. "Robert, please, let us not make a permanent decision over one uncomfortable dinner." Robert's expression did not change. Character is easiest to see when people think the stakes are low. Then he turned toward the doorway with Emily beside him, and the room that had spent the evening deciding whether she belonged finally understood that she was the one person whose presence they could not afford to lose. For the first time that evening, no one at the Whitmore table knew what to say. Richard stood halfway between his chair and the doorway, his mouth open but empty of power. Margaret's face had changed completely, the cold elegance replaced by panic she was trying and failing to hide. Vanessa looked smaller without her smile. The guests who had laughed politely at Emily's expense now stared down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by anything that kept them from meeting Robert Carter's eyes. Emily walked beside her father toward the entrance hall, the small wrapped gift in her hands, the engagement ring, still lying on the table behind her. She did not look back until Daniel said her name. "Emily, wait." His voice followed her across the marble floor, softer now, stripped of the careful tone he had used all evening. She stopped, not because she owed him more, but because she wanted to see whether he finally understood what he had lost. Daniel stepped away from the table. "Please, I should have said something sooner." Emily turned. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He swallowed, and for once, there was no family voice speaking through him, no polished excuse, no attempt to make the room comfortable. "I was trying to keep the peace." Emily looked toward the dining room. where his mother stood frozen and his father looked furious for reasons that had nothing to do with love. "You did not keep the peace," she said. "You protected the people disturbing it." The sentence landed quietly, but Daniel felt it. His eyes moved to the ring on the table, then back to her. "I was wrong." Margaret rushed forward then, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "Emily, darling, this has all become much more emotional than it needed to be. I truly apologize if anything I said sounded unkind." Robert looked at her. Margaret faltered. She had expected anger, maybe negotiation, but not that single word, not that calm refusal to let her soften what had happened. She forced a breath and tried again. "I apologize for what I said. I misjudged you." Emily's expression remained steady. "You did not misjudge me. You judged me exactly the way you wanted to when you thought there was no consequence." Vanessa stood behind her mother, pale and silent, until Richard gave her a sharp look. "Emily," Vanessa said, her voice thinner than before, "I am sorry too. I should not have made those comments." Claire Bennett stepped out from behind the dining room archway, holding her clutch with both hands. "Emily, I am sorry as well. I did not know they had invited me to make you uncomfortable." Emily looked at Claire and saw the difference immediately. Claire's apology had no strategy inside it. No business calculation. No fear of losing money. Just embarrassment and regret. "I know," Emily said. "That part was not your fault." Claire nodded, relieved but still ashamed. Richard, however, had no patience for apologies that did not reopen the door to profit. He stepped toward Robert. "Mr. Carter, I respect your reaction as a father. Any man would be protective in this situation. But I hope you can separate a private misunderstanding from a professional opportunity that benefits many people." Robert turned slowly. "You are asking me to separate your business judgment from your personal character." Richard stiffened. "I am saying business requires objectivity." "No," Robert said. "Business requires trust. Numbers tell me what a company can earn. Rooms like this tell me what its leaders will excuse." Richard's face tightened, and the guests exchanged glances because the meaning was clear. The Miami expansion was not just delayed. It was slipping away in front of everyone. Margaret clasped her hands together. "Robert, please. We can start over. Emily is welcome here." "Of course she is. We would be honored to have her in this family." Emily looked at Daniel then, because that was the cruelest part. An hour earlier, they had treated her presence like a stain on the Whitmore name. Now they called it an honor because her father had walked in with the power they respected more than decency. Daniel heard it too. His face twisted with shame. "Mom, stop," he said. This time the words were clear. This time they were loud enough. But Emily felt no relief, only sadness, because courage that arrived after the rescue was not the same as courage that stood there before it. Daniel came closer, stopping several feet away as if he understood he had lost the right to reach for her. "I love you," he said. "I know I failed tonight, but I do love you." Emily held the gift against her chest. "I believe you." Hope flashed across his face, quick and desperate. Then she finished. "But love is not supposed to disappear when other people are watching." The hope faded. Robert said nothing. He did not need to. He had asked his daughter what she wanted, and now he let her answer the rest for herself. Emily looked once more toward the dining room. At the glittering table, the untouched chair, the ring she would not take back, and the people who had only learned her value after learning her last name. "I came here tonight hoping to become part of a family," she said. "Instead, I learned I would have spent my life proving I deserved a seat at your table." Margaret's eyes filled with alarm. "That is not fair." Emily shook her head gently. "No, what happened tonight was not fair. This is just the truth." Richard's phone buzzed again, and this time he looked at the screen. Whatever message he saw drained the last color from his expression. One of his associates stood quietly, already understanding that the evening was over and that distance from the Whitmores might now be wise. Robert opened the front door, and cool night air moved through the foyer. Emily stepped outside with him, leaving behind the chandelier, the silver forks, the careful cruelty, and the man who had loved her too quietly. As the door closed, Daniel stood in the hall with both hands at his sides, staring at the place where she had been. Behind him, Margaret whispered, "We can fix this." But Daniel knew the truth before anyone else in that house was brave enough to say it. They had not lost Emily because Robert Carter walked in. They had lost her in every moment before that, when she had looked across the table and waited for someone to choose her. 3 weeks later, Daniel found Emily outside the community learning center just after sunset, carrying a box of donated books from the trunk of her car. The evening was cool, and the windows behind her glowed with the soft yellow light of children finishing their reading hour. He looked different without the dining room around him, less polished, more honest, but honesty that arrived late still had to stand in the shadow of what came before it. "Emily," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I did not come to pressure you. I just needed to say I am sorry without my family in the room." She set the box on the hood of her car and looked at him calmly. "I believe you are sorry." Daniel's eyes softened with hope. "Then maybe we can start again." Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought of the Charles River, the ring, the promises, the way love had once felt simple when no one else was watching. Then she thought of that table, that empty chair, and every second she had waited for him to become the man he had promised to be. "I loved you," she said, "but I cannot build a life with someone who only finds his voice after I lose mine." Daniel nodded slowly, as if the answer hurt but no longer surprised him. "You deserve better than what I gave you." "Yes," Emily said softly. "I do." He left without another argument. Months later, the Whitmore expansion was quietly taken over by another firm, and Margaret's perfect dinner became the story no one in their circle repeated out loud, but everyone remembered. Emily kept working, kept laughing, kept building a life that did not require permission from people impressed by names more than character. And when Robert asked if she ever regretted walking away, Emily smiled. "No," she said. "They thought I needed a seat at their table. I just needed to remember I was never meant to beg for one."